So I think we're live and it's 10:30 and I'd just love to welcome everybody and say good morning. This is Civic University Network. Hopefully some of you will have attended the opening session with the Minister, Karen Billy Moria, Lord Kerslake and Richard Brabner, and of course Andy Westwood. So this conference session is on the contribution of universities to inclusive regional growth. And I am Simon Collinson. I'm Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor for Regional Engagement at the University of Birmingham. University of Birmingham, explicitly established as a civic university by Joseph Chamberlain. We're also a founding partner of the Civic Universities Network and supporting its aim to understand the broader civic role of universities across the UK. My other job is I'm Director of City Ready. So in 2019, we were awarded RED funding from Research England for WM Ready. So we have a 4-year program of projects specifically focused on understanding the contribution of universities to local economic growth. So I'm going to be your host and the chair for the session. And just before I move on to run through the structure and introduce the speakers, I've got a few housekeeping messages for you. So first of all, the webinar is recorded. You'll see that on your screens. It's going to be made available after the conference via the network members area on the Civic Universities Network website. Now you can use the chat function throughout the session for general commentary and discussion, but make sure you send any chat to all panelists and attendees, please. And if you've got a question, please put that to the panel on the Q&A function on the bottom of your toolbar. Don't post panel questions on the chat because we'll probably lose them. Now, finally, for optimal viewing, please select to hide non-video participants, and the instructions to do that will also be provided in the chat function. That makes it a better experience for everybody. So again, questions on the Q&A function, and we're going to be opening up to a discussion later on in this session. So please do start posting your questions as we go through the session. Just in terms of structure, in a moment, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists and they're going to give us their perspective on this topic, regional inclusive growth and the contribution of universities to that. They're going to spend about 5 or 6 minutes on those introductions. Then we've got at least 40 minutes for discussion when we're going to take some questions from the audience. We've also got a couple of audience polls, so we'll send out some questions to you. There's only 2 of these, but we'll do that during the discussion. We'll ask your views on a particular topic and there's a multiple choice answer. And we'll flash up some of those results to see what the consensus about, the ways that universities should contribute to local economic growth going forward. And then finally, in terms of structure, before we finish at 12, I'll go back to the panelists for some final thoughts on our conversation. So setting the scene though, just to kick off, the work we're involved in at the West Midlands Regional Economic Development Institute shows that first of all, we've heard it from the opening session, universities are engaged in a really, really wide range of contributions to their host regions. These include things we can measure relatively easily: direct, indirect employment multiplier effects, investment, their spending, the spending of students. You can track this and you can see the sort of economic impact of a university in a place. But there are other contributions like skills from retaining students in a region, or knowledge exchange, and contributions to R&D and innovation spillovers. These are much more difficult to measure. When you get onto things like how universities support local communities in healthcare, well-being, the contributions to culture and the arts, it's really quite difficult to trace and track and quantify that contribution. But I think we need to get better at that. So evaluating and understanding how to enhance the contribution of universities to their places is key to what we do in our institute. And I suggest that as part of the pandemic, amongst other things, we're seeing these contributions becoming more deliberate, more conscious, I think, more strategic, more targeted, as universities are either, I guess, prompted partly by the pandemic, but also prompted by external mood music in government, in the public, other stakeholders, and external evaluation frameworks like the KEF, the KEF. They're being prompted quite rightly to not just showcase, but actually improve, enhance, and develop more strategically and in a targeted way their contribution to their place. So a growing number of universities that we map in the Civic University Network are setting up much more sophisticated strategic missions to better understand the current contribution they make to their regions, and also the potential contribution in the future. Now, 2 points on this that I think are really raised by our research, and before we go into the discussion with the speakers, these are key things that we find in what we're doing and how we're interacting nationally and internationally, comparing these sorts of growth contributions. The first thing is that inclusive growth is really complex. If you're targeting growth, it's one thing. If you're targeting a better distribution of growth, a reduction in inequalities as places grow, it's quite difficult. I mean, and it's clear that some things that universities do have what we call displacement effects. They add value, the economy grows, you're improving productivity and economic output, but you might actually be working against inclusivity, and that applies to any organization or any investment. If higher income individuals come into some regions, GVA goes up, but actually you can displace lower income, lower skilled groups. And in a sense, it might happen through house prices or demand supply gaps for skills, but there are trade-offs. And we need to be absolutely clear that we're trying to look at several different kinds of growths. And this is complex. So we want inclusive growth. We also want sustainable growth, but we have to absolutely improve competitiveness and productivity as we go forward. And again, disentangling the contributions alongside other organizations of universities in their places is complex but important. The second point I'd make is that, and I've made this before on these kinds of platforms, is that there is tremendous variation out there. There's variation both in terms of the growth opportunities and the challenges for particular regions, whether they're skills deficits, transport infrastructure, lack of entrepreneurship, or the fact that universities in a particular place are focused on other things. So there's a difference in our regions and where they might be able to grow. And secondly, there's a tremendous variation in the degree to which universities, either consciously or through evolution, are actually aligned with these place-specific growth opportunities. The degree to which teaching and research programs, outreach, engagement, cultural activities may or may not be a good fit with what is really needed, what is the top of the priority list for businesses, firms in a region, or communities, local communities. So one of the things we're trying to look at is the alignment or misalignment, how it varies between places, and how you can almost customize or tailor growth plans with universities in mind, so that you can focus on those areas where alignment could improve, but the bang for buck, the impact, the contribution itself is maximized. So those are the sorts of things that we are discovering as the complexity, but we're absolutely signed up to the mission and the core principle, which we heard in the opening session of this conference. And our work is trying to disentangle and enhance the ability of universities to add value in their places. Now, as I said earlier, we've got a lot of people signed up for this session, over 300 people registered. So I know we've got a good showing, and we'd love to get your views on these issues. So we're going to put out a couple of audience polls, and we'll run these after the panelists have made their opening statements. And one is on the priorities that universities might focus on if they're looking to grow their contribution. And then the second is on what we might fund as a nation if we want to improve local collaboration to target inclusive growth more effectively. So please do pay attention to the polls. Please do post your questions on the Q&A, and please do tweet and get out on social media to advertise the discussion we're having. Now, let me move on now to the speakers themselves. I'm going to introduce each speaker by name. One by one, I'm going to not run through all of them, but I'm going to ask them immediately for a short statement, say 5 or 6 minutes from each of our speakers to kick off the discussions on the topic of the contribution of universities to inclusive regional growth. And it's fantastic. We've got a super panel. I'm so pleased that these people have made time for this conference panel. And we're going to start with the Right Honourable Chris Skidmore, MP, who is the former Minister of State for Universities, and he's going to start the discussion from our panel. Over to you, Chris. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, and Thank you for that sort of comprehensive introduction. It was a pleasure while I was Universities Minister to be able to help participate in the sort of launching of the Civic Universities Network, to see the organisation begin to take shape. And since leaving office, I've had the sort of pleasure of being appointed chair of the advisory board of the UPP Foundation. And I welcome today the announcement that the foundation is making available another £50,000 to the network in order to look at how we can foster a sense of a green civic universities. And I think with COP26 taking place this year, and with universities now spearheading the drive towards net zero, that's clearly an area of inclusive growth in regional communities where universities can make a clear difference. I'm sure we'll come on to talk about that. I did want to say also I value this opportunity to talk about the missions for universities. I do view the network as having a mission, in the same way you've mentioned Joseph Chamberlain setting up the University of Birmingham as the first civic university with a very specific mission for its own metropolis. That the network is an active network that seeks to challenge itself, seeks to be self-critical, and seeks to look to improve at every moment in time, rather than sort of sit back and be self-congratulatory on examples of best practice, but to probe what needs to happen for the future. And that's where I want to take my contribution today. I think the first session talked about clearly the value universities had played in helping to prepare local communities for the pandemic. And I can remember tweeting myself, truly civic, and highlighting the role that universities played in preparing PPE and really sort of obviously helping with the R&D aspect of the vaccine. And I'm sure it's been highlighted by the minister earlier. But the point to make here is that that is only temporary and will be quite sort of quickly forgotten, no matter how tremendous that contribution was. And so when it comes to looking at inclusive regional growth, one of the most important messages is obviously to make sure that it's sustainable. Sustainable not only so that it has impact within the region continuously, but I think also for the university itself to be rewarded and continue to be recognised for the impact it's making. I think all too often that universities do need to be recognised and rewarded for the impact they make. It's not simply a one-directional traffic where universities must be civic in some kind of act of charity. There has to be a reciprocal opportunity here for universities to embed themselves in the local communities, and that clearly needs to happen more often. We've seen with research from the UPP Foundation that often there's sort of two twin tracks here of the universities having conversations, setting their strategies for the next decade, highlighting what they want to do to be able to drive economic growth. And and I've seen this in my local area in Bristol, where university research partnerships have enabled the National Competence Centre to be set up in my constituency, the Advanced Automotive Propulsion Centre by the University of Bath. All of these are on the sort of outskirts of the local sort of Bristol region, in science parks, which are clearly driving economic growth and making a real difference regionally. But is that impact being felt in some of the most deprived and marginal communities in my constituency? And I doubt it. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves and say, well, universities have made an enormous and continue to make an enormous difference when it comes to driving the future of our economy, when it comes to research intensive activity, when it comes to meeting 2.4% of R&D being spent on R&D. Yet there is more that can be done. And I think when we come to looking at inclusive growth, and obviously there are a wide range of definitions of exactly what inclusive growth should involve, I think it's the participatory aspect where universities can add the most value. And I think this is where we've got the opportunity to redefine the narrative of what universities are there for. All too often, universities have bought into the prevailing narrative of a 3-year degree leading to a certain graduate outcome, whether that's a well-paid job, a sustainable career for those individuals. And the problem with that existing prevailing narrative driven by the longitudinal education outcomes surveys is that it creates a ratcheting effect. There will never be a point where the university is able to catch up, because almost there is a sort of inflationary principle taking place. And I think what we need to do is to bend this narrative arc towards one which recognizes the value that universities place on helping to retrain for the world of work, alongside the priorities of the Future Skills Bill that's about to be published shortly, and to recognize that universities have the opportunity to train and reskill individuals and communities beyond the 3-year degree model, so that we should be looking at universities how we really participate in higher technical education. We don't simply just leave this to the FE sector. And this could involve level 4, level 5 qualifications, but I think really importantly, micro credentials and courses that can be taken by the 80% of those individuals who are already in work and maybe seeking to reskill. And obviously there are a number of regulatory levers that are going to need to be changed and pulled to be able to achieve this. But I think universities have that opportunity to look at how they can create inclusive growth through actually improving the life chances of those individuals already in work. And obviously that's going to need the universities to step up to a leadership role of looking at how that they can build partnerships with FE colleges, with existing universities. Now, many universities are beginning to do this. Some do it incredibly well, others less so. Yet I think it's for universities not simply to wait for government to come up with the policy, but to be active participants in the policy creation here of the post-18 education landscape and the creation of a tertiary sector that doesn't pit HE against FE. I would say also that when it comes to universities, the whole idea of the public realm is becoming incredibly important. I think there's a public narrative here around seeing sort of universities themselves having improved their own capital infrastructure and what they can do to reach out into sort of local high streets to be able to look at how they can improve the social value of the public realm also. And I think there are a number of universities looking at how they can partnership with local NHS trusts in order to be able to deliver future jobs, to be able to deliver future training opportunities. But all this, I think, and I'll finish here, points to a communication strategy that is needed. And this belies the point around inclusive growth, because if you ask anyone on the street what inclusive growth actually means, very few people will be able to tell you, but they'll be able to recognize what inclusive growth is if it makes a material difference to them. And far too less often, universities are sometimes humbled in not coming forward to actually really sell what they do very well. And that's not only about sort of trying to create new courses and opportunities in terms of education, but I think also really demonstrating what they have done for their local communities. And I just want to say, today I've just got a leaflet through the door from my local FE college with a newsletter sort of setting out what they've done for the local community. I've never seen that from the local university. And I think universities need to think also about, when it comes to inclusive growth, actually selling the story is as important as the policies that they put in place themselves. It's a politician's trope to say that if a photo hasn't happened, the event didn't take place. I think when it comes to strategies for future inclusive growth, I would prioritize around skills, that universities do need to think hard about how they can sell that mission for themselves in order to be able to take the credit and to bend that narrative and change the narrative for the public good, but also the good of the universities, because the universities deserve that recognition. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much for that. That's a super opening set of statements, and particularly the key points around impact being felt. I guess a need to switch a little bit to understanding outcomes from the perspectives of our stakeholders rather than outputs from a perspective of a university. So that's a super kickoff. We're going to move straight on now. And it's wonderful that our next speaker is Alice Frost, who is the head of engagement for UKRI and is going to address the issue for the day, the inclusive growth contribution by universities. Alice, over to you. Thanks.
So I'm going to say something that fits with the very ambitious agenda that Simon set us to talk about inclusive growth, but it's probably very complementary to what Chris has talked about. to you about. I'm going to focus on the contributions at UK Research and Innovation, where I'm Director of Knowledge Exchange and Research England. I'm going to look at particularly at the commercialisation area, which is where I work particularly, and so on the agendas that Simon's raising around R&D, inward investment, and high value growth and productivity. I think it's important to reflect, we're actually, we've got a central topic of inclusive growth, but we're actually roaming across many different kind of policy topics that are live at the moment. So the government might be forming an innovation strategy and a places R&D strategy and a levelling up white paper, but often these are highly complex topics and important topics with critical numbers of partners in themselves. Now, I do believe that universities have enormous amounts to contribute across a huge range of different policy areas. And I think CUN is a great forum to describe and begin to celebrate and also measure all these contributions. But I think we need to consider these policy areas often need to bring together a range of different partners to really take a rounded view of the topic. And hence, if a government is looking at an innovation strategy or a places R&D strategy, they will be drawing together many partners to try and work out how to develop a way forward. And I think the most powerful testimony for universities is to speak with their critical partners in these topics. And I think CUN is doing a great job in bringing together universities and civic and local partners who can speak for the contributions of universities. And equally, it's important that universities would speak alongside businesses or important business bodies on certain other topics. I'm very conscious of this in UKRI, in Research England, because we have 3 levels of very important partnership. We work with research councils and Innovate UK in our UKRI family. We work across the 4 UK higher education funding bodies. And we also work very importantly with OFS and DFE on things like the funding of knowledge exchange through Hive. And those partnerships are all incredibly important, but we need to respect the important purposes and distinctions of those partnerships to get the best out of them. So secondly, I wanted just to say, as Director of Knowledge Exchange, I'm particularly with the contribution that knowledge exchange can make to these agendas, recognising that both UKRI and Research England have many broader instruments that they deploy to help with inclusive growth. But I'm looking at the knowledge exchange bit. We define knowledge exchange as all the forms of higher education knowledge-based interaction which lead to economic and societal impacts. And therefore, we don't look, for instance, at expenditure effects that Simon mentions, and we can debate why, but our focus is on how the knowledge base can contribute. We distinguish in things like the knowledge exchange framework between the underlying knowledge capabilities that universities bring to the table and their knowledge exchange performance. So we're recognising that great knowledge exchange may flow from different universities that bring to the table different disciplinary mixes, different research or teaching contributions, different physical infrastructure contributions. So we distinguish between the knowledge exchange and the underlying capabilities. And that helps to understand and I think describe the incredible diversity of universities and the incredible diversity of higher education contributions that there can be. So I think knowledge exchange, my theme is partnership. Knowledge exchange is only as good, it's not as good as the university, it's as good as the partners you find who join with you in creating the impact. And the diverse capabilities of universities mean that they have to find very diverse, different partners in order to come together and create impact. And I think that's what Simon sometimes calls absorptive capacity, finding the partners who can really work with the knowledge you create. Different places then have different characteristics, and that is the differences are in the mix of the universities and the higher education providers they have, in the knowledge exchange partners they have available and willing to partner in the area, and also the kind of wider and underlying conditions. So, I mean, I think that comes up why this area is very challenging is the diversity of the universities and the diversity of the partners and the diversity of places, and incredibly. this complex conditionality is why we need we welcome really valuable CUN experts like Simon and Ed Ferrari we've been talking about to unpick the evidence around these different conditionalities. I mean, I like to think of CUN already as a sort of what works for civic policy and practice. So the final thing I'd say that from all the evidence we have, knowledge exchange, universities do a lot of local knowledge exchange. I mean, we always say knowledge exchange is a contact sport. So the closer together you are, the easier it is in some ways to do knowledge exchange. And one of the reasons we've decided to partner with CUM was to explore this civic and local dimension. Some evidence, most universities, include some place KE objectives in their HIVE strategies. Nearly 80% of universities quite spontaneously mention local partners and initiatives, quite unprompted in the industrial strategy plans to us. And finally, we have knowledge exchange framework, local growth and regeneration narratives, which we're currently analysing for evidence, and they all show all universities have some extremely important local contributions. My only caveat at the end is that most universities also do national and international knowledge exchange and use our funding for that. And that reflects the diverse nature of their capabilities and the need for them to seek out the knowledge exchange partners who can do and use that knowledge most effectively, which may be national or internationally. And finally, I suppose the vaccine challenge is a good example of that. So thank you.
Alice, thank you very much for that. I mean, it's absolutely true that Research England and the broader UKRI family are trying incredibly hard, putting a lot of resources into precision. How would you make funding schemes more precise to optimize the use of those resources for the wider good? So that's fantastic to see. Now we're going to move on, and please keep posting questions. We've got a few on the Q&A, but do post some more. And it's a real pleasure, though, to move on to invite Alistair Jarvis, Chief Executive of Universities UK, to give us his opening statement. Alistair, over to you.
Simon, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to join the discussion today. It's really good to be with you all to discuss this really important topic. I'm going to make some comments about the politics and then outline what I see as the big opportunities for universities to drive inclusive regional growth. So when you hear government ministers speaking about dead-end degrees and berating universities for promoting a woke culture, you could understandably think that it's a tough time for universities, where the agenda of government and the work of universities is perhaps poorly aligned. However, I've got to be clear, I think that's a misreading of the situation. As we start the recovery from the coronavirus pandemic, I think there's a real opportunity for universities to place themselves right at the heart of economic and social recovery. And this is very much something that should be a shared priority for both universities and for government. In last week's Queen's speech, the government made it clear that its intention. They said, and I quote, their intention was to level up opportunities across all parts of the United Kingdom, supporting jobs, supporting business and economic growth, and addressing the impact of the pandemic on public services. Now that sounds like a challenge which universities are ready to live up to. And this is a mission which I think universities can play a vital and central role in helping deliver. I think we can help communities to renew, we can drive local economic growth, and universities can be the civic anchors that provide a foundation on which regeneration and recovery from the pandemic can be built. A couple of years ago, I was a commissioner on the UPP Civic Universities Commission. And I believe that the initiatives such as the Civic University Agreements and indeed the Civic Universities Network, which is hosting this conference, are absolutely valuable in underpinning and strengthening the local partnerships and helping to identify what works. The vital need for post-pandemic recovery of communities and indeed the recovery of the economy makes this agenda, the agenda of the Civic Universities Network, I think more urgent and more necessary than ever before. And I think there's a real imperative now for universities to increase their civic impact and drive inclusive growth. This is not an add-on to what we do, this should be central to what universities do. And I wanted to briefly highlight three ways in which I see universities contributing already strongly to inclusive regional growth, but also to suggest how we can do a bit more in each of these areas. I think firstly, universities' convening power is key. The leadership and convening role of universities is critical in building relationships with key partners in the locality, in the region, whether that be with colleges, local authorities, bringing in the health sector, bringing in business, engaging with the public. And I want to see universities use this convening power to show leadership in the planning and the driving of economic recovery in their localities. I think each area should have a clear recovery plan, each locality, with the university using its good offices to identify what the local needs are, convene stakeholders that matter, engage communities, and help shape and develop the recovery plans, and indeed play a role in driving these local recovery plans forward. Secondly, universities' role in developing workforce skills is vital and indeed more necessary than ever. Universities should reconsider the short and also medium-term skills needs of local employers and ensure that they are providing the courses that meet these skills needs. And for me, that's not just full degrees, but it's short courses, it's bite-sized courses, it's modules, collaborating with local businesses, collaborating with the local public sector to meet not only existing skills need, but also trying to identify what the emerging skills needs are for the post-pandemic recovery phase. I think now more than ever, we need an education system that's accessible and enables people to study throughout their lives, so they can retrain to meet new skills needs and of course have more than one career in their lifetimes. Thirdly, I wanted to mention the important role of universities in enhancing the regional impact from research and from innovation. You'll be aware that the government published an R&D roadmap last year that set out a vision to ensure that R&D interactions support wider efforts to level up the UK. And of course, university research already acts as a beacon for investment and indeed drives innovation. But I think we need to, as universities, redouble our efforts and ensure that knowledge in our universities can be translated into benefits for society and the economy in all regions. Initiatives like the Knowledge Exchange Framework and the Knowledge Exchange Concordat, I think, can play a helpful role, and we've got to build on their early impact. As part of this, I see universities considering whether there are new post-pandemic challenges that their research and innovation can help meet. So this could be from innovating to help businesses evolve and change to seize the opportunities in the post-pandemic world, but also from research to help find solutions to the new challenges that are emerging because of the pandemic. I think one thing we can all be clear on is that the world will be different post-pandemic than it was pre-pandemic, and therefore there will be new needs from business, from local economies, there'll be new challenges to meet. And I think universities are very well placed to help meet those challenges. This is such a rich topic with so many positive examples right across the sector, and also many opportunities for where we can do more in the months ahead. I'm really looking forward to the discussions today. Thank you.
Alistair, thank you very much for that. And we're going to possibly test part of your 3 recommendations with the poll that we'll put up in a moment, but that's excellent. Thank you very much. Last out of the panelists to speak is Anne Kime. It's wonderful that Anne's given up the time for this panel session. She's the Chief Executive of the Chartered Association of Business Schools. And I'll hand over to Anne. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's great to be here. Universities are often derided, aren't they, for being elitist and otherworldly. And yet at the same time, they're being tasked with doing more and more things, making sure not only that they educate young people, but that they keep them happy, that they look after their mental health, and so on and so on, that they keep out of trouble. All of this is building pressure on universities. And at the same time, they're being told that higher education is a marketplace where it's survival of the fittest. Everything is judged and ranked, money being given out or retained accordingly. We've got the REF, the TEF, the KEF. There's also international competition. And all of these things just go to encourage this elitism. They act as disincentives to cooperation between institutions and against doing things that are not ranked or don't bring in money, which I guess is what inclusion's about. And the really interesting thing for me is that in spite of all of this pressure, we have the creation of the Civic Universities Network. And we've seen a huge increase in the amount of public good that universities are setting as part of their agendas. So the question is why? Why are universities doing this? I think it's because they're being brave. They're brave enough to say, actually, this is what we're about. These other things are important, but this is really what we're about and what we stand for. And as I said, what I really like about the title is the inclusive word. Now, the Chartered ABS produced a report in December 2016 on business schools delivering value in local and regional economies. So it's talking about place. We talked about income students bring to the local economy. We talked about teaching the next generation of business leaders. We talked about impact from research undertaken. And all of these are great and they're right and it's true, but they don't necessarily talk to the inclusive element of the question we're being set today. Obviously, there are elements around all of these activities that do make a difference. There's research in how you make the healthcare system more efficient for everyone, for example. You also have widening participation schemes. There are wonderful examples of outreach programs to tell even younger, ever younger people about why they might want to consider going to university. And these are people from backgrounds where no one in their family has ever gone to university before. And a lot of this is unseen, which is where I really do agree with Chris's comment about we need to make this more visible. Now, I'm really lucky because I get to see some of the fantastic work that goes on in universities because I'm a judge of the Times Higher Awards. And some of the things that go on, I would never have known about if I hadn't been a judge. And that just seems wrong. But, you know, we know what the press is like. They like the negative stories, not the positive. So we had a task force, as I said, in 2016. We've got another one coming up that is around business schools and the public good. And there are some amazing examples of what goes on in business schools to promote public good. But again, not all of it's about inclusion. So I thought I would give you an example of something that's really inclusive. In 2019, a small group of business schools decided they wanted to support micro businesses in adopting technology. So this wasn't about developing new tech, which people get excited about in research terms. It was about helping these micro businesses to use technology that already exists to make their businesses more profitable. With a small grant from government, the work began. Then COVID hit. Suddenly, these businesses weren't interested in learning new technology. They just wanted to survive. So these business schools changed what they planned and helped the businesses in the best way they knew how. Now, none of this was ever going to make money for the universities, but it was helping micro businesses in their local area. I'm really pleased to say that following that, government realized that business schools, you could replace that with universities, business schools are just part of that, could and would work together for a common cause. So from those small beginnings, the government launched the Help to Grow scheme with business schools at its center. 30,000 SMEs from all over the UK are set to benefit from the program that will not make the business schools any money, will not take them up the league tables, but it will require many of them to work together on the same program, sharing the best that each school has. And we know that there will be SMEs who will be thinking that these university types are elitist and not living in the real world. There'll be those who are fearful because they may not have been to university and just don't know what it's about. But we know from previous programs that the vast majority will be so grateful that they have been on the program, grateful for what they've learned and what it will mean for their businesses, whether a baker from Bangor, a farmer from Somerset, or a gaming company from Dundee. So just to highlight this, a couple of quotes. These are unsolicited comments on LinkedIn about the previous Small Business Leadership Program. This program has added so much value to myself and my business. It's transformational. Fantastic content, ideas, and invaluable advice on how to make your business work in an ever-changing landscape. That is what universities can do when they're not being forced to compete with each other. And obviously there's going to be some level of competition, but it's also what universities and people in universities want to do. We need to shout about this type of work far more frequently. As Chris said, sell the story, change the narrative, because I think people need to know what it is that you're doing. And by saying we are a civic university, you're partway there. So I am really proud to be associated with the business schools in the UK. And I think what universities are doing is fantastic. So really, I really want to say, well done. We need more of it, but we need more government support for it to happen. That's it from me. Thanks, Simon.
And thank you very much for that. I mean, one of the lessons from this is we need to do some new things, but where there are existing structures or infrastructures and existing relationships between universities and local stakeholders, it's often a question of resourcing them and scaling them up so that they can do more good work in their contributions. So thanks to all our panelists, that was excellent. We've got a whole wide range of issues that have been covered. What we're going to do now is go to some questions, but first, as I advertised at the beginning, we've got a poll, and I'm going to ask Shireen to put up the first Zoom poll question. This should appear on everybody's screens, and you're invited, please, to look at the question. If you think universities should do more to support inclusive growth in their host regions, what should they prioritize? And select up to 3 of those listed, including one, which is I do not think universities should do more to support inclusive growth. They should focus on other priorities. So can I invite all the attendees to just go ahead and click through those, please, so we can then get some results on the poll, and we can show those as we go through some of the Q&A and the discussion. Now, as we're waiting for people to fill this in, I've got a good set of questions lined up for our panel. And I'm going to start. And Shireen, if you could show us the findings of the poll when we've got enough respondents later on in the session, that would be excellent. But we're going to go straight to a first question while people still fill that in. If panelists could show themselves now, that would be really helpful, and we can see everybody. Thank you very much. And we've got the first question comes from an anonymous attendee, so no naming names, but this is a good question here. Are there potential conflicts between universities acting as civic universities, and their commitment to students? So have we got a split obligation, particularly students who are in their first year of study, not at the point of seeking work? Are there conflicts between the obligations of universities to the place they're in and the obligations of universities to their students? Can I go to Chris, please, to start on that, and then we'll go to Alistair and Anne, just to respond on that particular issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. I think my knee-jerk instant response would be to recognise the obligation of the student and the place as 2 sides of the same coin, if that's not sort of an appropriate metaphor, in that the student themselves often will be travelling to a new location, will be by their very nature vulnerable in terms of arriving at a new strange destination, and by helping to equip that place with opportunities to be not just welcoming is the wrong word, but basically what I think would say is that by taking a place-based approach, by improving the fabric of the community, by helping to work to break down silos and barriers between communities and universities, that actually you sort of break that, I mean, it doesn't really exist, but it does in some universities, the sort of town versus gown approach. And then actually it will benefit the individual student if they're able to feel welcomed in the town that they are moving to, rather than being seen as some other part of the community. So no, I don't necessarily see a distinction. I recognise the point the individual is making, in that universities do first and foremost have to look after their students, who ultimately are the purpose for their existence. But actually, by working on a civic approach, everyone benefits. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, there's some really nice feedback coming on the chat line as well. But let me go to Alistair on that question. Thanks.
Simon, thanks. I mean, I think there clearly could be a tension, but I think it's mutually beneficial for students, local communities, to do everything they can to avoid that being a tension. What I mean by that is students are also citizens, and they're also part of their local communities. And then therefore, I think it's a responsibility for students to be good citizens and to show respect for those local communities that are welcoming them there. But of course, it's also of benefit for the local communities to be welcoming for students. And of course, we all know the financial impact of universities, the fact that businesses grow because the students are there, the cultural diversity students bring, and of course, the contribution they make through volunteering and other activities in their local communities. So I see this as a mutually beneficial relationship, not one that's always easy. And of course, there's tension between students and local communities, but actually, I think there is a mutual benefit of making it work. So I would like to see students giving to local communities as much as they can, respect for those local communities, but the local communities also making the place as welcoming for students and seeing the benefit of students.
Yeah, super. No, thank you very much. And I'm going to go to Anne in a second, but anyone who wants to send out a chat to everybody should send it to the panelists and the attendees, please. Otherwise, a very small number of people will see it rather than a very large number of people. Anne, over to you on that question. Thanks.
Yes, I'm going to violently agree with both Chris and Alistair on this. It's not an either or. This is something that, sure, there will be tensions at times, but that's going to happen between your first years and your third years, quite frankly. So, you're always going to have a tension. And if I can give you an example from my time as a judge on the Times Higher Awards, there was a wonderful situation where a dreadful flood had happened in the local area, absolutely awful, just before Christmas. And the students, especially the international students who were on campus, they weren't going home for Christmas. They got out there, they were putting out sandbags. They were, carrying local residents and some of their goods into safety. They were really part of the community, as Alistair was talking about. So I don't see it as being a conflict. These young people, when they leave university, will be working in a community. No matter what it is, they need to learn that. But there is an awful lot that the local community gets from it as well. It's just about getting the two together. And that's the role of the university.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to go to the second question in a moment, but we've got some results from the poll. Can we put that up, please, Shireen? So there's a marginal lead, two leads, supporting low-income communities and aligning teaching programs towards more local skills shortages, the demand-supply skills mismatch. Just in the lead, Alice's area is just a close second with developing R&D programs. And then supporting small local firms further down the tree. Interestingly, nobody has chosen that they don't think universities should do more to support inclusive growth. So that's, I think, a very positive outcome. Thanks very much, everyone, for voting on that. We'll have the second one a little later, but it's just nice to get a bit of a consensus from quite a large audience, actually, about what priorities you think we should be following. Next question, though, it comes from a colleague of ours, John Goddard, who spent a lifetime understanding universities in their places. And he's got an interesting dilemma here, because it's true that not only do places vary, some places don't have significant universities, and some places are towns which are disconnected from a lot of the growth drivers in our economy. So John says, is there a role for big civic universities in the core cities to support inclusive growth in less economically successful places? In other regions. So if we can go to Alice first on that question, and then we'll go to Chris and then Alistair.
Possibly. I think I suppose the other thing is to recognise there are other players than universities. So there are other partners like FE and local businesses in towns and wider areas. So that would be my only nervousness of saying there has to be and there's also a slight danger in this is we're seeing it sort of in a very central civic university sort of style, not in a sort of organic bottom up. So, you know, is there a danger that the sort of fiefdom of University of Birmingham comes? So I think I can see the argument that there are contributions that different kinds of universities can make, and that those shouldn't be limited to perhaps a narrow framing of cities. That, you know, the work, for instance, Sheffield AMRC does, you know, about creating an innovation corridor could be, you know, very transformational for a much wider area than the Sheffield city. But my only slight nervousness is that we are saying that this is somehow all orchestrated by universities. I suppose my point about partnership was the humility of universities to follow, not just lead.
Thank you, Alice. Yeah, over to Chris on that one.
Yeah, I'm just going to specifically talk about R&D to this point, actually, because I think it is quite relevant about what sort of needs to happen when we look at sort of so-called levelling up of funding, of which I'm obviously doing an inquiry at the moment for the Higher Education Commission. Obviously, we have, you know, in UKRI a number of sort of funds with Research England on expanding excellence in England, the Connecting Capabilities Fund, which is obviously they are beginning to work in terms of, you know, what do you do when you've got a agglomeration of expertise, you know, often traditionally around in cities, and obviously that's not necessarily a bad thing. Excellence tracks excellence, and, you know, towards a successful R&D policy. But you're trying to move against sort of, you know, decades of, you know, this magnetic effect. You know, what's going to work? I think this is where you've got to transfer across from a place-based approach to one that recognises potentially subject-based expertise. So the innovation audits that have been conducted by UKRI, highly valuable material just sitting there at the moment, not really being made sort of use of. And I hope that the government's innovation strategy will pick these up, because so much good work have been done to demonstrate, even in communities that don't have high levels of research and development activity, nevertheless they have opportunities to expand in those specific areas. So taking a sort of vertical approach rather than horizontal place-based one around what we could do to try to drive collaborations and involve those areas, I think is critical. And then using the structures that either exist at the moment, whether that's through the Catapult network, expanding that to be able to reach out to other areas and communities which predominantly may be involving SMEs rather than tier 1, tier 2 industries, because the Catapult network, I think at the moment has you know, not necessarily been as successful as it could be in reaching down the supply chain in order to allow university collaboration to take place through there. The AMRC was just mentioned, and the success of the AMRC was not just in building a R&D ecosystem in an area that traditionally was, you know, deprived coalfield estate. It was also, the point of the MRC was to build in a pipeline that addressed a skills need. So it wasn't necessarily about those individuals doing sort of high-level discovery-led R&D. Obviously, manufacturing materials meant that actually they needed a wider supply chain. And so that's what I'd also sort of really would like to say. This is where we can take the core cities approach and build it out into sort of cold spots around skills. And there are a number of opportunities in the devolution process, like the Bio York proposal for the North Yorkshire mayoralty, for example. That's a collaborative approach that involves the University of York, but critically recognises the supply chain need within an agricultural economy for the FE colleges to be involved as well. So I would say partnerships are absolutely critical here. It's not just about the university, and it's the university strengthening its opportunity to grow through the partnerships with other organisations such as colleges, and also recognising the existing potential through the work that's been done on the audits.
Excellent. I mean, that's a super set of, both comments and recommendations. And this idea, as you are absolutely rightly identifying, that we need a deeper understanding about the smart specialisation or particular competitive advantage of places before we target particular investments at those places. In our region, we have the Manufacturing Technology Centre and the WMG, Warwick Manufacturing Group, which are translation machines. They're more than R&D. They do skills training, capability and capacity building across small supply chains in the region. And there is almost a portfolio of different interventions right for different places. Thank you very much, Chris. Alistair, did you have a comment on that regional sort of imbalance question?
So, Simon, yes, yeah, thank you. I mean, I think civic universities do have a role to support places with no universities, but they absolutely mustn't be imperialistic in their approach. I think it needs humility, it needs an understanding of local needs, and it probably therefore involves working with and supporting local partners. I certainly don't think there should simply be a university campus in every place. And that's largely because I think sustainability matters. It needs to be a long-term commitment. And it's really not good if a university arrives with a big bang and thinks it can solve all the problems of a place and then leaves quite quickly because they find it's not sustainable. So I think, yes, universities do have a responsibility to support places with no universities, but they need to be quite innovative in the models they use. It will depend very much on the locality's needs. I think it's often better delivered in partnership with others, maybe with other local businesses, councils, FE colleges. And I think also there's a role to support schools. And I notice there's a panel later on the sort of whole education system. But actually, sometimes the best input a university can have is not about offering higher education in that particular area, but supporting the schools and the attainment at that level. So yes, I think there is a responsibility, but universities have to tread carefully and certainly not pretend that they are the answer to all an area's problems.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. There's a sort of subpart. Another attendee has come up with a question which was really related to this, and this is Sanawar Khan. I'm going to ask Anne just for reflections on this, but universities based in London, what is the best way of leveraging meaningful contribution to growth in London? Is it local authorities? Is it the Mayor's Office, the City of London bodies? Anne has a lot of experience as a citizen in London based there, but this is a tricky question. I actually had the temerity to suggest on a different call that University of Lincoln might have relatively more impact in its place than Imperial College London. And on the call was a very senior academic from Imperial College London who demonstrated very effectively that Imperial College did have a significant local impact in their region. But the question is still there. London is a very different planet to the rest of the country, and in some ways grappling with the various local authorities, mayoral office and others. And how do universities connect and add value in that particular context?
Yes, I mean, London is a big place, but it's also a number of little villages, I think. And I think that's where that's where also, where Kingston can influence will be very different from where University of East London can influence. So it's about, again, it's still being within your region. Some of the bigger, very central universities, I think it's a different dimension. But if we look at King's College and look at the business school there, they're looking at doing something very different from the other universities within London. They're not doing an MBA, for example, but they are working with small and micro businesses. So it's about, I think, that it depends on what the individual university wants to focus on, because some local authorities, as we know, some local LEPs will be very good and great partners and will be effective partners, and some less so. So I think it's about the university knowing their local infrastructure, knowing people locally, and that's by outreach, and then finding out what works best in their area. We know that there's no consistency across anything, just as there's no consistency across universities, there's no consistency across, mayoral authorities or local councils. It's about finding what's most effective in your particular area, I think.
Thanks, Anne, and you have a thanks from Nat Day on the chat line, who's for acknowledging that London is a village is a combination of villages is a really good way of putting it. Yeah, not lumping it into one area. So I've got more questions to come. Can we first go to the second poll of this morning's session? So I'm going to ask Shireen to post the second poll, and if attendees can please click on their preferences. Where should we direct funding to create more collaborative contributions to local inclusive growth? And you can select up to 3 of the following: R&D funds for universities, R&D funds for firms, more strength in places type funding, which quite a few people think has been pretty successful from Research England and UKRI to direct funds in particular places, or more knowledge exchange and translation mechanisms, apprenticeships, or prioritize R&D programs that include local skills development. This is one of the things we've talked about in the past, is that universities do connect skills and R&D. Other organizations, particularly government policymakers, tend to separate these into different ministries, and innovation is about connecting skills development and R&D. So while people click those buttons, we'll look at the findings of that in a second. Let's go to a question from Felicia Fye, who's I think in Bath, and she's a really excellent academic in her own right. But she rightly points out that currently her proposition is that the incentives for academics to engage in civic work is really not in place yet. So if we go to REF, KEF, and various other measures, academics are really encouraged to focus on internationally outstanding research publications. And we won't get into the rigor versus relevance issue here, but it's clear that that is top-class publications. And secondly, TEF. I mean, teaching tends to be based on feedback from current students. So the point she's making is local issues, and spending your time and your expertise on local issues or the civic agenda tends not to align with what you either get promoted for or is incentivized for. So is it, how do we connect admirable ambitions to local contributions to actually connect and support academics in their day-to-day operational support for the civic agenda? So if we can start with Alistair on that question, then we'll go to Chris, Alice, and Dan, if all four of you can address that issue, please. So Alistair, your views.
Simon, thanks. So two thoughts. Firstly, I think it is right that universities incentivize and support their staff when their staff's focus is on local regional impact. So I think the incentives do have to be in place, and I think a university that cares about civic impact should be thinking about incentives that are matched to that civic impact. I think it's sometimes a misreading to say there's something like REF or KEF, particularly REF actually, that something of the internationally renowned cannot be local. Indeed, actually, some of the most internationally renowned research has a very local impact. So I think it's internationally renowned in terms of the quality, the standing of that research, rather than it necessarily having to be internationally focused. And also, of course, although slightly moving away from the civic universities, of course, some of the world-leading research which leads to advancements in other countries, again, has a very local impact in other countries. So I don't think there's simply a sort of dichotomy between local impact and being internationally renowned. I think you can be both. But the wider point is that I think universities, if they are serious about being civic, then they should be incentivizing local regional impact as well.
Okay. Thank you. And this includes staff and students as well. Yeah. Chris, over to you. I mean, this may be something you've grappled with. It's a long-standing issue. It may be something you grappled with as minister.
Yeah, I think there's always been sort of talk about what would the future of the REF 27 sort of look like, and certainly in our evidence sessions around sort of levelling up the R&D funding for universities, the issue of impact has been a strong one, and how you might be able to tailor impact in also sort of buy in local community support for R&D in the future. And obviously we can recognize where some of that might lie, and I hope that when it comes to designing REF 27, that we could look again at the nature of impact and how it can be recognized. But there is a tension with also the government's commitment to then reducing bureaucracy and making sure we don't overlay additional bureaucracy on top of what is existing. It does need a reevaluation and a simplification in order to deliver on this. But one of the reasons why I said I wanted to be the minister for KEF and knowledge exchange framework and make sure that I prioritize that. Joe Johnson had taken forward the TEF and obviously established the KEF, but I was very keen to show that KEF wasn't another sort of piece of bureaucracy. It would give the universities a moment to spotlight and to shine and to really highlight what they do well. And I think the first iteration of the KEF has demonstrated the value of the diversity of the university sector and demonstrating those universities that have already well-established patterns of working with local businesses, with SMEs, and they may not be, they're not the traditional Russell Group universities, and that's given them a confidence and a sense of pride in actually what they have been doing is now going to be recognised. And so, embedding the KEF, I think, is the next stage. And what we must then look at doing is actually saying we have this metric, rather than it just being a sort of a prospectus, that actually it counts for something, and that actually funding is directed through the KEF. Now, what that funding is a separate question. You've got the uplift in R&D, and to what extent we look at sort of new funding mechanisms. I'm keen on that in terms of establishing sort of simpler, sort of fewer pots of money, and a wider scheme that might sort of be able to be overlaid across a multi-annual sort of framework. But I also recognise that the fastest way of getting money out the door is by using the existing mechanisms that there is. So tweaking those, in particular, putting more money into the higher education innovation funding, overlaying the KEF on that, so that access to HIFE is dependent on sort of success in the KEF. And potentially, and this might be sort of controversial, but it sort of need to be looked at sort of closer around sort of, are there any levers within QR also where you can sort of overlay the KEF without compromising on the ability for QR obviously to sort of act as that sort of crucial flexible mechanism for making up research shortfalls.
Fantastic, thank you, Chris. Alice, we're right in your territory now, KEF, and I think most people will take us in the right direction in answer to the question, but your views.
Well, I just want to say that Chris has given a very eloquent and far better account than I could, both of the KEF and also the potential. I'm not going to say more on that, which is great. But I suppose, to be fair, on the research side, we sit a lot of time in UKRI with really, really dedicated, knowledgeable colleagues in research councils in Research England, like Stephen Hill and Innovate. And I think they are, when I listen to them, I think it's exactly the point that Alistair made at the beginning, that they are very conscious of identifying the most important problems there are that can be solved by a national research base. And they're not neglecting problems that may be locally important, because what they're really looking for is the greatest number of the most important problems. So I kind of, whilst I love the, I obviously I want to promote the KEF, I do think we have a research-based system that is very concerned to find the right problems and deploy the right academic expertise to solve those problems.
Thank you, Alice. No, that's super. And I mean, I think things like KEF are evolving narratives and metrics to really understand where the strengths of different kinds of universities, the differentiated portfolio we've got out there. So. Anne, you might want to comment. The original question is around this sort of incentives problem for faculty, staff and students. You might want to comment on business schools directly. We've been doing a bit of work on how business schools could do even more to bridge between campuses and regional growth as sort of channels, particularly to firms in regions. But over to you, your views, please.
Yes, and I have to start by saying I don't think everything that a university does has to be about there is room for both. And I think we need to remember that the local is important, but it's not everything. There is definitely a tension between, if you're an academic and you want to get promoted by working with your local community, or is it by being published in 4-star journals, getting great NSS results, maybe to a lesser extent. So I do think there needs to be a realignment here. And I'm perhaps going to be a little controversial at this point, and disagree with some of the things that have been going situation of to fly, where to solve one problem, you then take on something else, and then you take on something else, and it gets bigger and bigger, and suddenly you end up with all these perverse behavior, simply because you were trying to solve one issue. And I think that's what happened with the REF, the TEF, the KEF, and I just wonder what's going to be next. and I think there needs to be an element of, well, hang on, do we need to rethink all of this, and have a different way of doing it, so that we do reward and recognize people for doing different things. Now, I suspect that proponents of the TEF and the KEF will say, well, that's exactly what we're trying to do. But I'm saying it's still out of kilter, because getting, being published in the 4-star journal, you will still be seen as being worthy of being paid more and promoted more than if you were working on knowledge exchange. And so I think that there needs to be a full rethink about what we do. And I think that's exactly to the heart of the question that's been asked here. It's about, what are the incentives, and how do you make sure it all gets done? The same happens with interdisciplinary research, is because it's not seen in the same way as pure research in a very focused area. And I think these things need rethinking. So sorry if it's a bit controversial there.
No. I think that's ideal. It captures, I think, quite a lot of views of people actually within universities. Is that, number one, there's continual overlays rather than stopping doing some things and starting doing other things that judge your performance. It's overlays that add, to be frank, some fragmentation in clarity, particularly for ECRs, early career researchers, about what they need to be doing. There's no question in my mind within campuses, the relevance agenda and the ways to add value to societies, the economy outside campuses certainly raised itself in terms of its prioritization, its profile. I think then we've got to come down and address the time lags in the mechanisms by which academics are rewarded, and that is an institutional shift that I think needs to happen personally. Let's move now to see the results. We've got a lot of respondents, well over 100 respondents to the poll. Here are the results to the second poll. The second poll was, where should we direct funding to create more collaborative contributions to local inclusive growth? And in the lead, I don't know whether Alice will be pleased or not about this, but this certainly seems to validate the targeted, focused approach that Strength in Places funding takes. That's 67% have gone with that. More knowledge exchange and R&D translation mechanism, interestingly. And that's ahead of R&D funds for universities or R&D funds for firms, but R&D funds for universities takes the lead. I suspect we have a predominantly academic audience, so that probably biases that slightly. But a reasonable showing for prioritized R&D programs that include skills development. So many thanks, we won't do any more polls, but many thanks everybody for taking part in those polls. They will be captured and used by the Civic University Network in part of the intelligence gathering for this whole conference. So I appreciate that. We've got time for one more brief question, and then we're going to move in to hear from each of the panelists in terms of their final thoughts and a wrap up, and then some final sort of ideas of where the Civic University Network is building resources that everyone can dip into. So we've got it's a slightly tricky one, but it's an interesting one, which is two people have asked this, but it's to do with community wealth building and anchor institutions. And the example given by an Alistair, a different Alistair, in Belfast local authority of growing focus on community wealth building and how cities anchor institutions. This includes universities and other organisations can contribute towards community wealth building, and in particular using things like procurement strategies. We have an anchor institutions program at City Ready that's working with 7 anchor institutions, including our own university. And for example, by changing your procurement spend, and privileging smaller firms, more local firms, firms that do more training, firms that have accessibility programs for low-income communities, you can make a big change in a region as a large anchor institution without actually spending more money. That's the sort of sweet spot to this. But community wealth building is at the heartland of the civic agenda. If we can just run through quite quickly, this is not disconnected from the other issues we've talked about, but how do universities do more of that? And there's a connected question from somebody who is obviously involved in social enterprises. And the question there is, how does a social enterprise connect with a university? Because they're finding it very difficult to find the right sorts of people who lead on these agenda items. So, if we could start with Alistair on that quite briefly, and then we'll go to Chris, Alice, and Anne. So everyone have a go at this one, please, and then we'll start the wrap up. Alistair.
Simon, thank you. I mean, the example from Queen's sounds fantastic, and I'm clearly very supportive of the focus of universities in community wealth building, and procurement can play a big part of that. I think another angle on this is actually recruitment policies of universities in terms of the staff they recruit as well. And I think that some universities do it very well and have a very strong local recruitment policy. Others, I think, don't necessarily look in their local communities. And of course, it's not about just recruiting people locally. It's actually about helping people locally develop the skills so they can then work at the university as well. So I think it's more than just saying, are there people in the local community that could work for us, but actually it's saying, are there people in the local community with the potential to work for us, and could we help develop their skills so they can get good jobs at the local university?
Yeah, thank you. Chris.
I think that there's a number of good examples where social value has been prioritised by universities, such as thinking of sort of Northampton, for example, which has obviously taken a decision to mainstream that through their strategies for the next sort of 5-10 years. And I think the role of the network can obviously be to highlight best practice and sort of the difficulties that might come with that level of supply versus how they can with larger than themselves take on sort of more sort of local populations. So universities, not only using the sort of their procurement power, but also their sort of influence on training and reskilling local medium-sized companies, as well as working with SMEs. I mean, on the point around social enterprise, I guess it's sort of, there's always this sort of point of tension I still feel between how does the university demonstrate its footprint and how does it reach out to make those connections, because obviously there are networks, and the university is only going to be as good as the individuals who work and are active within them in building those partnerships, which are ultimately sort of human. But there does need to be a sort of geographical location by which these connections can be sort of forged. And I think universities are coming to recognise the importance of knowledge hubs, of venues by which individuals can sort of gather together. And I wouldn't sort of rule that out as being something that is important and we can do more of. That I think sort of actually there's something around specifically going out to look for opportunities, but also there's something about opportunities falling on your lap, and also unexpected opportunities, and how you as a university provide for that I think is quite important. So actually giving social enterprises and those involved with that the opportunity to access university facilities, to be in a space where they can sort of bond and come together and maybe actually make partnerships they weren't expecting to make. And I think we need to think about that as part of the strategy, as well as sort of targeted focused partnerships.
No, very good points, and it echoes also Alistair's opening points. His first of three, I think, was around the convening power of universities. Resources are distributed, but there is a neutrality in universities in their positioning. We're not politicians, we're not businesses, we are neutral, and we have evidence. But convening power to bring people together around the table, that's a really good point. If we can go to Alice and then Anne on that particular question, and then we'll ask you all for your final thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting area where CUN can play an important role. Is that we go back to the fact universities do so much, and what universities are great at are both the convening power, but also the massive diversity of experts and connections they've got. So you take any topic, you can always come up with lots and lots of examples of incredibly different and nuanced approaches to this. Now I can come up with three things. I mean, I think we've worked on social enterprise for the last 20 years. So we had a social entrepreneurship program when we were in HEFGE. We count social enterprises in HEBSI. We've just funded a Red Fund program, which was quite interesting, which is Northumbria University, which was about a sort of accelerator venture capital support for social enterprises. And we've got the Connecting Capability Fund aspect program led from LSE, which has done a lot on the importance of social enterprises as social science commercialization. So I think the challenge is always, how do you map, how do you signpost to this wealth of potential with lots and lots of big and small participants in the economy and society who, if connected up, could do so much. So I think the central problem is always just there is such enormous and diverse potential for universities to contribute, and how do you make that visible at the political level, but then how do you actually make it accessible at the local distributed level? And I mean, I think that's possibly a really great challenge for the Civic Universities Network, both to get all that richness and then find the ways to describe and measure it in a way that can land with all these different audiences.
Thank you. Thank you. I absolutely agree. Anne, over to you.
Yes, I think Alice is right. Universities can't be all things to all people, but they can let people know what it is they can do. I looked a couple of years ago, and I think things have got better, but a number of university websites will have the sort of community or the business bit, and it's where you go, and if you're a business and you want to find out how can I link up and get information on something, and it has a form you can fill out, and they want all your details, and then you tick an area to say, this is what I want help with, and that's it. It goes into a black hole. You have no name. As a business person, you have no name, you have no email address, you have no phone number you can contact. It's just a form that's filled in online. You know, for goodness sake, universities, it's a simple thing to do. Tell people what it is you're good at, and give them the names of people who will be able to be that first point of contact. So I think there's something really simple that universities have been getting better at doing, but also invite people in. Invite them in, say, we've got this wonderful speaker, advertise it in your local community, and leave it open for other people to come in, because that first foot in the door is usually the most difficult, and relationships will build from that. And I've seen examples of this where someone went to a guest lecture and ended up staying on, doing an MBA and becoming an entrepreneur in residence. That's how it happens. And so it's be open and share.
Excellent. Oh, really great advice. And I think it's true, particularly to some universities that are disconnected from the societies and communities they're located in. They really do have to make a proactive effort to open their doors and go out and meet with those communities. Fantastic. That's excellent. We're going to move to wrap up now, and I'm going to go around the panel for final thoughts, a minute each, before we wrap up the session. And I'm going to start with Chris, and then Alice, Alistair, then Anne, if that's okay. About a minute each. That's super. Sorry to put you on the spot, but your reflections so far have been excellent. So over to you, Chris.
I want to sort of end by just saying, how can we ensure that universities continue to win hearts and minds? They've clearly done that during the pandemic. The work was excellent. How do we expand on this? And obviously, how do you get out of this false narrative and the trap of this false narrative of universities being somehow woke institutions that sort of aren't necessarily focusing on the priorities of local communities? We know that's not true, but it's how we can change that narrative. I would say in the chat it was mentioned about school education. The UPP Foundation did polling. Richard Brabner may have mentioned it. The number one issue that people would like universities to focus on is raising standards in schools. And so seeing universities as education institutions that might be helping to be responsible for their wider area, both in terms of upskilling the adult population, helping to inspire the younger generation, I think is a mission that universities should buy into, because it will gather support. And then there's a number of easy wins that the universities can do, badging up what you do, putting out leaflets in local communities, even taking a shop out on the high street. I mean, the rent's only going to cost you £5,000 a year, yet alone you could be doing that as a shop front to sort of sell the potential for new micro qualifications, for courses that universities might offer to help train local populations. I think the possibilities are endless, but universities do need to be critical in self-reflecting on what extra value that they can add, because I believe that universities are fantastic institutions that can do much more, and as a result of doing more, will gather more support.
Chris, thank you. Super. Thank you very much. Over to Alice.
So I'm really pleased with the result that was 67% for CIP and 59% for the things, because both SIPF and KE are in my area, and so I wouldn't have been able to go back to the office virtually anyway, unless we'd had some element of parity. I think it's notable. We worked with the Cambridge UCI New Policy Evidence Unit and NCUB, who did a survey of universities and their contribution to innovation. And I think it was notable there that universities themselves, unprompted, the thing they wanted most was actually support for their innovation role in place. So universities themselves really just stepping forward, actually, but they could have asked for anything. They wanted more support for place. Quick plug for Trevor McMillan's work on the Concordat. I do agree with Anne Kim about you need to say what you're good at and connect. And I think that is exactly what Trevor McMillan was saying. You say what you're good at and say how you connect with me. And I think that's the central vision of his KE Concordat work. And then finally, I think the Civic Universities University Network, we have to talk about them because that's why we're here. Absolutely vital, I think. And the central problem I have found in the past, I've told this story before, but I talked to a big think tank, a political think tank ages ago, and they looked at universities and then they said to me, I can't believe this. This is not possible. No organisation could help with health and education and economic growth and R&D. No one organisation could ever do that. And I think that is the central focus problem you have. Universities are just, the interdisciplinary nature of universities make them so rich in their contribution that nobody then ever believes any of the contributions. So I shall leave that as a central challenge for the CUM.
Alice, thank you very much. Super. And I think we're over to Alistair and then Anne.
Simon, thank you. My closing comments are going to be quite similar to Chris Skidmore's. I think the pandemic challenges mean that local communities and economies need our universities to deliver impact more now than ever. And I think, therefore, the pandemic recovery period is a major opportunity for universities to show their worth, for universities to shine, I suppose. And in doing so, I think they can improve their reputations locally, but also nationally, supporting local businesses to innovate, identifying local challenges, using their expertise to find solutions, and also meeting the new and emerging skills needs. On all of those themes, next week, Universities UK is launching a major new campaign to showcase universities' vital role in the pandemic recovery. And I hope everyone at this conference will support this campaign. And it's about the social and economic impact of universities. So I'll share more details when it launches next week. But I think hopefully it meets sort of Chris's challenge that we've got to get out there and this is our time to shine.
Fantastic. Anne.
Yes, I'd say universities are in a really difficult place because they're trying to meet so many demands. They're trying to get their funding. They're trying to rise up the league tables, and yet we have this the Civic University Network. My final bit is keep working in partnership. You show people out there why they should love and defend universities rather than having to do that yourselves, because other people are your greatest advocates. So engage with them and look for long-term commitments.
Anne, thank you very much. So, I mean, I've got three groups of people to thank. That was superb. I mean, first and foremost, what a wonderful panel. I mean, such a wealth of experience in various different parts of our sector and hugely reflective. I mean, these are people who've been grappling with these issues for a long time. It's not a short-term issue. And in some ways, it's fantastic to hear the wealth of that experience in the panel. So thank you very much for giving up your time today and addressing and answering questions, actually. So, second group are the attendees. We've had some wonderful comments on the chat line. We've had a sharing of some best practices from different places and different universities, and that's always added value. So you've added to the resources of the Civic University Network. Great questions. There are more questions than I had time to share with everybody. So again, thank you very much we had a very large number of attendees. And, thank you very much also for filling out our pop-up polls. Before I leave, there's one more poll to fill in, and that's going to come up. I think it's come up on your screen. And there's one more question. We'd love your feedback. just, you know, what are you taking away from this session? And this is going to be the case for all the conference sessions. We really want feedback in terms of shaping future conferences of this kind. You can also engage with the conference on Twitter, and the handle and hashtags should be on your screen now. But also go to the conference board, the place space on Padlet, and there's a free members area on the Civic University Network website and a network newsletter. So you can look at the chat line, all the links are there, and you can connect with the Civic University Network there. So my final thanks of the three groups, after the panelists, superb panel, and the attendees, I'd like to thank the conference organisers, Sheffield Hallam team at the Civic University Network Hub, absolutely super team that has done a lot of work behind this session and the whole conference. There are many more sessions over the next 2 days on equally fascinating subject areas around the civic universities and their contribution. So I'd love to see more of both panelists and attendees at these future sessions over the next 2 days. 12 o'clock. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you again to the panelists, and have a lovely rest of the day.